This girl was strong and poor, but she'd always worked hard. Now, she worked inside of the shoe factory, but on her own feet she only had clogs. She didn't like the work. It was hard and heavy work, and the machines were all around, and the wheels would turn and the pulleys would pull knives that would cut at the leather, because a great steelworking factory had been built in the middle of the beautiful countryside, and now, on this winter's morning, as the snow fell heavily all around, she wished that she wasn't in this place, but she had no choice. She had to work there, and for all of the work that she would do, 6.5 days of 1 week, she would get 8 pennies. It was not as if she would get to keep them for herself, because when she went home, she would hand over the money to her parents, and the money would be used to feed them all, herself, her mother, her father, and her younger brothers and sisters. She didn't like this work. She would have to pull twine through the leather, but she didn't wear gloves. She'd have to thread it through and pull it with her own hands. And when it was cold, especially now, she would find that it would cut into her fingers, and the snow, if it fell upon it, would sting at her fingers. But this was the only work that she could find. And there he was, the factory owner, standing there, drinking from a cup that would have taken at least 2 of her week's wages to pay for. "Get a move on, girl. Don't waste my time. If you work hard, then you make me more money." His voice was harsh on her ears, and he stood there, and she looked. His fingers were like the softest of all leathers, and yet hers were cut and scarred. And he stood there, and now he was coming closer. "I said, girl, get a move on." On his back, he had a frock coat, which had long tails that hung down. It wasn't often that he went inside of the factory, because he wouldn't have worn such clothing. As he was coming towards her, perhaps to raise a fist, to shout louder into her ear, the bell rang. The bell rang for the short time that she would have a break. "You will finish those shoes before you eat." And now he was even closer towards her. And the tails of his frock coat got caught inside of the pulleys, the mechanism that would slice the leather with its sharp blades, that would drag holes through it, where she would have to pull the twine and thread. "Finish it!" But then he was starting to be pulled further back, and he could see that he was being dragged towards the machinery. For all of the terrible things that he'd ever said to her, she forgot about them. She would not leave him to be dragged into the machine in that way. And she knew full well that he would do nothing to help her, but still she grabbed towards him. She grabbed hold of his coat, and she was strong. And between her and the pulleys, the coat was torn exactly in half. It hurt him to have to say thank you to her. He stood there. He looked quite ridiculous with only half a coat upon his back. But he looked at the damage that the machinery had done to what was left of that coat, ripped and torn. And it wouldn't have just been the material, it would have been his own skin and blood that would have been crushed inside of the machinery. But it really hurt him to say thank you. She'd saved his life. "I know what I'll do. I will give you." And here he looked, and he pulled a basket where they kept all of the nails. "I will let you take as many pennies as you can place in the bottom of this basket." He thought of it. Perhaps she could lay maybe 10 by 4 along. 40 pennies, still a king's ransom. 40 pennies, that was nearly 5 weeks of her wages. The girl looked and smiled. "All right, I'll do that. Here, give me the basket." The factory owner placed a huge pile, a mound of pennies on top of the table. He thought that she could only place them one beside another, beside another, beside another. But this girl was no fool, for she took a penny and placed another penny on top of it. No, you cannot stack them one on top of each other." "It's all right, sir," she said. "I'm not going to stack them on top of each other." She took the pennies and laid them side by side. And instead of putting the one beside another, she lay them on the sides in columns. The factory owner said, "That's enough." "No, sir, I think that you said that I could put as many pennies as I could lay on the base of this basket." It wasn't just 40 pennies she could place in that place, or 100, or 200. It was 450 pennies, side by side on top of the basket. More money than she would have earned in 5 years. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it was enough for her to pay the old woman at the end of the street. It would teach you to write and read if you had a penny in your pocket. She used the money well. She taught herself to read and write. She learned well. She grew stronger, not just in her arms, but inside of her mind. She used the knowledge that she had got to make herself a better life. A better life than working for 8 pennies a week. Florence Darling Williams had been named after two of the most famous women in all of the Victorian era, Florence Nightingale and Grace Darling, both of whom had been in all of the papers. But she was rich, and now she was out by the side of the soft shell sand sea, and she was out walking, away from the house, for now it was a fine and bright summer's morning. She loved to go down by the salty sea. She loved to be in that place, for she did not have to work, and her mother didn't have to work. Her father owned a great factory, and he would only go inside of that place infrequently, because he knew that the money would still be pouring inside of his pocket, which meant that he had a great house and a beautiful garden where his wife could work, and a daughter who did not need to know what it was to use her hands to work. Florence Darling, as she went by the side of the soft shell sand sea, she could see something moving beside the rocks. It was a fine summer's morning, and she could see someone or something, and she was quite surprised to see that there was a boy whose clothes were rough and frayed at the edges. His clothes were dirty, his hands were dirty, and at the tips she could see that he'd broken fingernails, unlike her own hands, which were soft and almost like porcelain. "Who are you?" Florence Darling Williams' voice was sweet to the ear, but this boy was suspicious of anyone who came close to him. "What do you want? What's it to you who I am? I am a boy who has worked hard, and I have been working all this night, and now I need to find some shelter and a place where I will not be burned by the sun, and I will not be cold, so leave me alone." She was shocked. A boy about the same age as her, who had worked all night and now was trying to find some shelter by the side of the sea. Florence Darling had always had a smile on her face, but now when she went home her mother was quite distressed to see that there was no smile upon her daughter's face. Her mother was working in the garden, cutting at the flowers and stacking and sorting them and putting them into posies and bouquets. "Florence, what is it? My darling daughter, what is it? What is it that causes you to look so sad?" The words tumbled and spilled from out of Florence's mouth. She told of how she was so shocked to see a boy with rags on his back, no shoes upon his feet, and who had had to work in her father's factory all through the night. The mother looked. "I wish that there was something that we could do, my darling, but there's nothing. It is just the way of the world. Your father has the skill and the enterprise and the money to make sure that these children at least do not have to starve." But from what Florence Darling could see, this boy was a stranger to food in his belly. She went away, far away from her mother, to the far end of the great garden, away from where all of the flowers were grown, for there was a part of the garden where they grew vegetables, potatoes, carrots, parsnips. She knew that her family could spare them. She dug them out, and for once in her life, her fingers were dirty. There was dirt underneath her fingernails. She pulled up the carrots, the potatoes, the parsnips, some onions. She went into the house, and with cook she peeled them, cut them, chopped them, mixed them with some stock, and she made a great pan. Now, she wasn't expecting this boy to be grateful. She was never expecting this boy to say the words please and thank you. But what she did do was she made a huge pot of broth, vegetable broth, and she took it down to that place where she'd seen the boy. And it was hot, and it was heavy, and for one moment in her life she experienced what it would have been like if she'd had to do work. Her fingers were still dirty, but she placed that pan at that place beside where she'd seen the boy trying to find some shelter by the side of the soft shell sand sea. And she knew for at least one day he would have food in his belly, food that would warm him. And I'm not saying that anything changed overnight, and I'm not saying that the whole world changed just because of one good gesture. But when she grew from a girl into a woman, she did all that she could to help those who were less fortunate than herself. On the first day of summer in 1834, you would have expected it to have been warm and hot, but it wasn't. It was damp. And Florence's cousin, her rich cousin, had come all of the way in a horse and carriage with his mother and father, Florence's aunt and uncle, had come all of the way to their grounds so that he could see what Florence was like now that she was older. Yes, he was younger than her. And even though he was rich and kind, he was allowed to wear scruffy clothes. It wasn't the same for Florence. No. She had to always be in her best clothes, with petticoats that made her dress flow out in front and behind, which was the latest fashion. But her cousin, with a cap upon his head and his short straight hair sticking out this way and that, and a jacket on his back with huge bright shining brass buttons, he was allowed to wear scruffy Wellington boots. Wellington boots on his feet, but it wasn't the same for Florence, no. Florence had to wear high-laced black shoes, and she was always told to keep herself clean. On the journey over, in the horse and carriage, her cousin had been told to be quiet. Inside of the house, they did as all children did. They were seen and not heard. And now that Florence, because she was older and bigger, she'd been given the job of looking after a younger cousin outside in the grounds of their house. Oh, they didn't have a garden. They had grounds with a well and a water pump and a small river and lots of trees around. Her younger cousin, he looked around. He saw the trees. And with his welly boots on, he started to splash. He splashed in the water and puddles. And his legs, because he wore shorts, soon became very muddy and very wet. Florence didn't really know what to do. And every time she came close to him, he would splash her. And her clothes had become dirty. And she'd been told to keep herself clean, because washing and cleaning does not come cheap. But when she looked and she realised that she couldn't change her clothes, she didn't get angry with him, for she was a kind and a loving girl. She just said, never mind. Never mind. This boy had eyes that darted this way and that, and he might have looked half asleep when he first came to the house. But now that he was outside and in amongst the trees and in the fresh air, he looked to the top of a tall pine tree, and there he could see a small nest. It didn't take him long to start climbing up. But muddy Wellington boots are not the best thing to try and climb in. Oh yes, he got to the top and he saw the nest. And the nest was made out of twigs and leaves and mud, but there were no eggs inside. And so when he tried to turn around to come back down the tree, with his Wellington boots being slippery and muddy, he did slip and he fell, and as he slipped and fell, one of the branches of the tree caught his leg just above the knee and tore the flesh to just down to where the Wellington boots met the top of his legs. His blood and the mud on the ground soon started to mingle. Florence knew a great deal of things, especially for a girl. She knew that if the mud stayed inside of the cut, then it would turn bad, septic. And she didn't hesitate for a single heartbeat. She rushed and she took a piece of cloth from off a petticoat. It was thick and woolen and orange. She ran over to the white well, where beside the well there was a bucket, and she threw the bucket down the well, pulled out some of the water, used the cloth from her petticoat and washed the wound. She washed all of the mud out of it, but still it kept bleeding. Florence was no fool, even though she hadn't as much schooling as boys would have got. The only thing for it would be to bandage it, but where could she get a bandage now without the wound on her cousin's leg getting dirty again? She knew that her parents would be angry when they saw her dirty clothes, so she knew that the only thing for it would be to tear at some of her petticoat and make that into a bandage, and that's just what she did. She ripped and tore at the clean cloth of her petticoat and wrapped it about her cousin's knee and leg, and the two of them made their way back to the house. I have got to tell you, the cousin was behind Florence and couldn't be seen by her mother and father or her uncle and aunt. When they saw Florence covered with all of the mud and water that had been splashed onto her, her parents spoke in this way. "Florence, how dare you show us up like this? Coming back into the house in this condition, and I've goodbye." But her father's speech was cut short because her cousin appeared from behind her. If anyone could have had more mud on them, I don't think that would have been possible. He had mud that dripped from his clothes, his nose, but his leg was clean and with a bandage made of material that the mother recognized. The uncle looked. "Well, I never did. A girl having the sense to clean a wound and bandage it. I've never heard anything like it. You're a very good girl. I've got a feeling," and here all of the adults agreed, "I've got a feeling, Florence, that you're going to make someone a very good husband." Florence had learned something that day. Learned something about caring and tending and using her mind to make sure that people did not have to suffer or be hurt or get infection into wounds. The soup tasted good on his tongue. He could taste the cabbage and the pork, and it was hot and it was spicy, and he couldn't believe that he, as a Russian, was being dressed with clean bandages. He was a happy man, or he always had been, all the way from Russia to fight in the Crimea, but now he was in a hospital, a field hospital that was run by his enemies, the British. He'd been shot in his cheek and shot in his leg, but because he was an officer, they were treating him well. This had been a terrible winter in the Crimea. His leg, he could feel it stinging, for dirt had fallen inside of it, and he knew that he would not be able to keep his leg. And when he was taken away, he saw a woman who was walking amongst all of the wards with a lantern, holding it high. She was speaking to all of the soldiers. She was making sure that they were comfortable. He couldn't believe it. Underneath his bed, he could see that there was a bowl there to hold blood. But he was also given fresh water to drink, and his wounds were washed regularly. And always this woman was there with a lamp in her hand. She would go from bed to bed, and even though he could not speak English, she would talk to him, and her voice was caring and loving and concerned. She would always look, and if there was no other nurse available, she would do the work herself. Her voice was strong, and he could hear it from the far end of the ward where he was. As the days went by, with the soup to warm him and make him stronger, he could sit up and remembered looking into her eyes, and even though he could not understand her words, she made sure that he was comfortable. But one thing that he did notice, that as she was going along, she was always writing. She was writing in a book, checking who had been washed and cleaned, who'd had the bandages changed. She was writing it down, the numbers. He thought that this was a good thing, and he'd never seen anything like it. But the thing that astonished him the most was this. One day, when he was well enough to stand up and be carried out of his bed to sit in a chair, to sit at the end of the ward, all of the soldiers who had been lying on the soil floor were picked up and taken out of that place, and this woman, with a strong voice and a caring eyes, was making sure that stone slabs were placed on top of the soil to make sure that the wounds did not get dirty. A stone floor was laid down, which was scrubbed every day, and he watched. And he got quite used to the idea that out of every 10 men who came into that ward, 5 of them would not survive. It almost seemed as if they were more frightened of going to the hospital than they were of fighting in the war. But once this woman had become in charge, and she made sure that wounds were washed and food was given to the men, whether they were Russian or English, that they were all kept clean and they were spoken to. Well, it was maybe only 2 out of 10 who would die inside of the hospital. Fresh bread was given to them every day. Potatoes were given to them. But there was a smell of soap in the air, always. Strong, carbolic soap. Many years after the war, when he walked with a leg that was made out of wood, with a stick in his hand, he would read in the papers in Russia, so many years afterwards, that this woman was so famous. And he remembered hearing her name, Florence. Florence, a lady with a lamp in her hand, who had tended to him, an enemy of Britain, but she had not cared, because she had looked after him and treated him like a human being. He felt proud to tell his grandchildren that he had been tended by the lady with the lamp. There was a woman who lived in London, and she had so much money that she had everything that she thought she would need, but still she wasn't happy. She thought that as a woman she would be able to do more, but she wasn't allowed, not by the way that the country was run. She would have to do as she was told by her husband, and she decided that one thing that she could do would be to write. She'd always liked putting pen to paper. As she read through the newspapers, she looked and she could see there were always articles about Florence Nightingale. She'd returned from the Crimean War some 40 years before, but nobody had written a full biography of her, and she decided that that was what she was going to do. She knew where Florence Nightingale lived, and she knew how to get there, and she was going to go and knock upon her door, and she knew that she would be able to talk to Florence Nightingale. Talked to her about the things that she'd done about nursing, how she'd worked with all of the doctors, how she'd developed nursing in Britain. And she went over to the dusty old house that Florence Nightingale lived in, and she knocked upon the door. The door was eventually opened by a servant. "Hello, ma'am, can I help you? What is it you want?" "I would wish to talk with the mistress of the house, Mistress Nightingale. I would wish to talk to her so that I could interview her and I could write a story about her, the true story of what happened to her when she was in the Crimea." The servant looked at this rich woman at the door and said, "I don't think that the mistress would like to talk to you. She hasn't been out of her house for many years, and I'll put you in a parlour and I'll have a word with the mistress and see if she wants to talk to you." This rich woman was quite surprised. "Not wish to talk to me? But I would write a fine biography of what she has done and what she has seen." But she was led into the parlour, and in the parlour there was a coal fire. It was banked up. It was roaring. And she watched the fire, and it got lower and lower, and still she waited, and soon she wondered whether it would be right and proper for her to get out of her chair and put some more coal onto the fire. But the maid came back into the parlour and said, "I'm sorry to tell you, but I do not think that Mistress Nightingale wishes to see you. Not anyone." The rich woman couldn't believe it. "Not see me?" The maidservant was tall, and she was strong, and she walked right over to the door and opened it and said, "I bid you good day, and I hope that you have some luck. But now the mistress needs to sleep." When she went outside, the rich woman thought about it. Ever since Florence Nightingale had returned as a hero, as a heroine, people had wanted locks of her hair, had wanted to take her photograph, had wanted to have her signature, had wanted letters, had wanted anything that belonged to her. They wanted to take photographs of her so that they could put them onto teacups, teapots, plates, tiles, commemorative plaques. For a great industry had grown up around Florence Nightingale, and people were making money from her image and the things that she said. And perhaps that's why Florence Nightingale had taken to her bed and had stayed inside and had not gone out. But the rich woman was not going to be stopped. She was determined. So she wrote a letter. "Mistress Nightingale, I would wish to speak with you. I would wish to give a true and honest picture of you and all of your works." But the letters would be returned. She kept on writing. She kept on writing, and one day a letter landed upon a doormat, and with excited fingers she reached towards it and she tore it open. She could tell by the address at the top that it was from Florence Nightingale herself. And the words were fair but harsh. "If you would wish to find out what it was like to do the things that I have done, then I would suggest that you get yourself along to St. Thomas's Hospital and work there. I would suggest that you clean the floors, tend to the soldiers who are returning now from the war in South Africa." It was true. A war had raged ever since 1899 in the Boer War. She was quite surprised that Florence Nightingale had said to her that she should work in the hospital, almost as a servant. But she did want to write this book. She went down upon her knees, and when she worked inside of the hospital, she scrubbed the floor with carbolic soap. In all of this world, she had everything that she thought she would need, but she had everything except Florence Nightingale's book on modern nursing. But she was learning the hard way. She would check the soldiers who would return from South Africa. She would give them clean water. She would give them fresh food. She would talk to them. And perhaps It was this that made those soldiers feel much better. She would keep them warm and clean, and still she would always be willing to get down upon her hands and knees, and her fingers that had once been so clean and white and like porcelain were now hard and calloused. But she learnt a lot about the way that people talk and how to care for people, just as Florence Nightingale had found out. She did receive a letter, and she wasn't sure, but when she'd been working inside of the hospital, she'd seen someone who looked like the servant, tall and strong, who was watching her as she worked. And the letter that she received this time from Florence Nightingale said this: "Please come to my home, and I will give you something that you will truly need." She was very excited. She thought that she was going to get an interview with Florence Nightingale so that she could write her book. But when she got there, once again she was shown to the parlour, and she watched the fire and she waited, but not so long. When she looked out of the window, she could see a figure with a dark dress on and a white cap upon its head, and a figure that did not move very swiftly, bent at its back, but laying something down on a bench by the side of a tree in the garden. When the figure had returned into the house, the servant came and said, "Mistress has left something for you outside. Left it for you by the tree." She went to the tree, and sure enough, there was a book, a guide to modern nursing, as written by Florence Nightingale. But when she flicked open the cover, she could see that it had been signed by Florence herself. And in it was written, "From one determined woman to another." Now she had everything that she ever needed. She had the book, and money and wealth, and she used it well, for she sent the money to the school of nursing, and she helped others to learn about nursing, just as she had learned. My name is Robert Stephenson. I was born on the 16th of October 1803, but this story is not about me. It's about my father, George Stephenson. You haven't heard of him? You might not know the man, but you will know of his work. With coal, fire and steam, he changed the way that the working man had to work, made their lives easier, made it easier for them to travel in this great country of ours. He was my father, the father of the railways, George Stephenson. My father was born in Wylam in Northumberland on the 9th of June 1781. At that time, life revolved around the pit, the coal pit. My grandfather, Robert, was a miner, and my father was going to be a miner too. Everywhere needed coal, and my grandfather worked on the steam-driven engines that sucked the water from out of the tunnels so far under the ground, the steam engines that had been developed by Newcomen and by James Watt. They took the water from out of the pits to make it safe for men to work in that place. And my grandfather was a fireman, which meant that he shovelled the coal into the great hungry engines. He and my grandmother lived with their 6 children in a small cottage. And apart from George, my father, they were all as thin as twigs. But my father was big and strong and hearty and healthy. One of my father's first jobs was to keep his younger sisters and brothers away from the wooden tramways that ran not 2 foot away from the front of their cottage. Horses would drag great wagons that were filled with coal along that way, and it was his job to make sure that he kept his brothers and his sisters safe and away from the horses that pulled the wagons. Looking after his brothers and sisters wasn't the only work that he did. When he was aged 8, he herded cows, he led horses at the plough, he hoed turnips and did anything that he could to earn money. The work at the pit was good as long as there was coal under the ground. But every family had to follow the work. They had to go to the next winning, the next new shaft that had been sunk, to go for coal. And they would go because the coal mine owners would tell them that they had to. My father George had lots of different jobs at all of the different pits. When he was 10, he drove horses on the tramways for 2pence a day. He became a picker on the screen. That means that he pulled the stones from out of the coal at the top of the pit. And he did this all for 6pence a day. He worked as a picker until he was 14, and then he was a man. At 14, he became an assistant fireman to my grandfather, and for this he got £15 and 12 shillings a year. That was all he got, but it was still good money for a 14-year-old. But George always wanted to be in charge of the great steam machines, and he had set his heart on being the plug man. Now, the plug man was the man who actually was in charge of the steam-driven engines. And when he came home at night, he would make models of the engines out of wood and of clay. My father was fascinated by the engines that he worked on, and in his spare time he would take them apart to find out how they worked, how they were made, and how he could make them more efficient. When he was learning about the engines, he couldn't always work at the same pit as my grandfather Robert. But when they did come back to work together at Newburn, he was in charge of the pumping engine and in charge of my grandfather. George, he soon helped on all of the machines, and he worked on the winding machine that raised and lowered the men into the pit. He was what was called a brakeman. But not everyone was happy in the way that he worked at this. They all said that he was too young, and there was one man in particular, Ned Nelson, who was known as the battling coalman from Black Callerton. He challenged my father to a fight. He was much older than my father, but my father won. When he was 18, George knew that he would have to learn a little bit more. He would have to learn how to read and how to write, for everything that he learned was only by what he'd heard. So for 3 years, he taught himself how to read and to write. And it did take him 3 years to learn the basics of reading and writing. But my father had great ambition, and he wanted to get on as an engineer, a mechanic and an inventor. He was supported by many people, but I've got to tell you, he hated the way that they spoke about him as a poor, untutored pitman. They spoke about him in this way even when he was famous and wealthy. But when he was 21, my father proposed to Frances Hindmarsh, a servant at a nearby farm in Newburn, and they were married at the local church on November the 28th, 1802. They rode the 15 miles on a horse after they'd been married to Willington Quay, a horse that they borrowed from a local farmer. Now, I was born on the 16th of October, 1803, but my mother was ill for a long time afterwards. My father had gone to Newburn because he was asked by the engine maker Robert Hawthorne to look after the stationary engines that pulled the heavy coal wagons up and down the hills and slopes beside the pit. Robert Hawthorne had a lot of faith in my father and believed in his skills and abilities as an engineer and a mechanic. I've got to tell you, though, that in later life, my father gave Hawthorne little thanks for all of his help when he was younger. In 1804, my mother gave birth to my little sister at Killingworth, Frances. Fanny, she was called. But she died 3 weeks later, and my mother died the following year, aged only 37. My father was now a widower at 25, and I was left with a neighbour while he went away to Scotland to find work. When he did come back, I was looked after by my Aunt Eleanor, Auntie Nellie, and it was she who brought me up after my father returned. My father, he fixed the expensive water pumping machine at Newcomen, but the men he was in charge of were much older than him, and they did not like being told what to do by a younger man, an uneducated pitman. Everyone started to notice him and knew that he was a brilliant worker and a good engineer, but he knew that he needed to be able to read all of the new scientific books that were being written. So he sent me to school, and I would ride to school on a cuddy, a horse, because I would come back with all of my school books, and at night I would teach him all that I'd learned during the day. When I had finished my schooling, Aunt Nellie left, and she was married herself, and my father proposed to his first sweetheart, Elizabeth Hindmarsh. He was quite a catch then. In 1820, he was earning £200 a year. Now, one of the biggest problems in the pit was the threat of exploding coal damp gas. And my father, when he was a brakeman, had seen many disasters. So he decided, by trial and error, to make a lamplight that would be safer than the exposed candle flames that the miners used at that time. He came up with the idea of a miner's lamp, a lamp that would not cause the coal damp to explode, and he showed his invention in December 1815 at the Literary and Philosophical Society Library in Newcastle. But wealthy, famous Sir Humphrey Davy had also been asked to try and solve the problem of the coal damp explosions in the mines. And he exhibited his lamp, which was curiously similar to the one that my father had made. He showed his at the Royal Society on the 9th of November 1815. Sir Humphrey Davy was given £2,000 in recognition of his invention, and my father got £100 for all of his good work. The Reverend John Hodgson and all of the Grand Allies who owned the pits supported my father as a poor, uneducated pitman. And eventually, in 1833, my father's claim as the inventor of the safety lamp was recognised in Parliament. Until his death in 1829, Sir Humphrey Davy always called my father a cheat and a thief. But once again, my father did not like the way that he was treated by all of these well-wishers, for they still spoke about him as a barefoot, uneducated, common pitman. My father is called the father of the railways, but he did not invent them. He did not invent the wheel. He did not invent the wooden rails or the steam engine. But what he did do was to take the ideas of Watt and Newcomen and improve them and make them work efficiently and reliably. The true inventor of the locomotive is the Cornish giant Richard Trevithick. Trevithick was 10 years older than my father, but just like him, he was as strong as an ox. Trevithick made his first engine in 1801, but it crashed into a house and set it on fire. In 1805, he came to Gateshead to make a locomotive, and it worked, but when it went out onto the wooden rails, it tore them apart. No one could think of a way to make a heavy engine run up and down hills without slipping off the smooth rails or breaking them. In 1812, a man called John Blenkinsop built a rack locomotive where there were cogs and slots by the side of the track that helped to keep the train on the track, but it wasn't successful. What my father did do was to take all of the ideas he had seen, heard or read about and put them together in his brilliant mind, and it was he who made them work. If you think about it, when my father was a boy, he had seen the wooden tramways. He had worked on steam engines all of his life. The French war with Napoleon was expensive, and feed for horses was expensive, and the pit owners needed a better, cheaper way to move all of the coal to the docks. So they gave my father the chance to develop his ideas of making an efficient steam-driven locomotive. George Stephenson, my father, produced his first locomotive train, Blucher, in 1814. He was 33 years old. Not bad for a self-taught pitman. It ran at an extraordinary 4 miles an hour. 4 miles an hour! On July the 25th in 1814, and it carried 8 wagons of coal that weighed together 30 tons, and that was much better than anything a horse could do. The Blucher was heavy and awkward and would break down all of the time, but this just made my father more determined to find out a way to fix it and make it run better. The engines that he made kept breaking the wooden rails, and this just made my father work harder. Every time there was a problem, he would try to find a solution to fix it. My father was very lucky because he was given 2 days a week to develop and produce new and stronger rails, and with the ironworks owner William Losh, he developed and patented cast iron rails, and all of Killingworth Colliery's tramway was lined with them. This was then followed by the 8-mile stretch of the Headon Colliery line, also being made out of iron rails. My father's brilliance was that he was allowed to build upon other people's ideas and mistakes, and then make them right and make them work. He was determined and stubborn enough to want to make them work. One of the things that people forget is the way that horses were treated on the roads, in industry and in the pits. It was cruel and unrelenting work, and my father knew that locomotives would save them from such terrible treatment. But people came from all over the world to see the track that my father had laid, and the locomotive, of course. Everyone was impressed. Businessmen knew that they would be faster, cheaper, better and more efficient at taking goods than canals and barges. In 1820, a Quaker merchant called Edward Pease from Darlington became interested in the idea of a network of railways in Britain. Quakers were known for their business enterprise and sober reliability, and together with my father, they developed the world's first public railway. Edward Pease wanted to help merchants and workers by making cheaper transport between the mines in South Durham and the North Sea at the mouth of the Tees, the River Tees. Edward Pease believed in my father's ideas, and his generosity and connections allowed the Stockton to Darlington Railway to be built. At first the company thought that it would be a steel rail tramway with wagons pulled by horses and men. My father, George Stephenson, had spent too much time with engines to let that happen, and he was determined to have locomotives on the track of malleable rails invented not by him, but by the Bedlington engineer John Birkinshaw. The first rail was laid in place on the 23rd of May 1822. Iron railway bridges such as man had never seen before were designed and made by my father, and in 1823 they were allowed to run steam locomotives on the track. I, with my father, Edward Pease, and Michael Longridge, opened our own locomotive factory in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1823. We had a faith in steam engines, and we knew that it was the way of the future. The locomotive locomotion cost £500 to build, and the grand opening of the first public railway on the 27th of September 1825 with a tender, wagons filled with coal and flour, the grand passenger carriage The Experiment, wagons of coal to be given to the spectators, and it was all seen by 40,000 people who had travelled from all over the countryside to see this new iron horse. It was a great day and a great start to what was to be the birth of the railways. My father did many unbelievable things in his life. He was not liked by everyone, but he enriched everyone's life with cheaper travel, goods and food. He did say of himself, and I can hear his voice, "People have tried to keep me down because of my abilities. People say that I am proud, but I have every right to be proud, as I have no peer. Others, like Trevithick, may have laid the foundations, but it is by my own enterprise, hard work and determination that I made their ideas work. No one can contradict me, as I am the only one to have developed the locomotive so that it is efficient and cheap."
Hear the click, clack, click, we're on the right track. It's good to go, better to come back. Get on board, hold on tight, our journey's just begun. The hiss of steam, sparks and smoke, heat the boiler, that's no joke. Gleaming engine, coal and fire, roaring through the night. Hear the click, clack, click, we're on the right track. It's good to go, better to come back. Get on board, hold on tight, so far away from home. Strong, dark, thick black smoke, diesel fumes will make you choke. Stokers gone, no coal, no fire, the suit upon the line. Hear the click, clack, click, we're on the right track. It's good to go, better to come back. Get on board, hold on tight, far away from home. Always gone, no more steam, no crackling coal, no whistle scream. Just think back to a better time when steam was king. Hear the click, clack, click, we're on the right track. It's good to go, better to come back. Get on board, hold our journey's just begun. So far away from home, far away from home, our journey's at an end. Hear the click, clack, click, we're on the right track. It's good to go, better to come back. Get on board, hold on tight, our journey's just begun. The hiss of steam, sparks and smoke, heat the boiler, that's no joke. Gleaming engine, coal and fire, roaring through the night. Hear the click, clack, click, we're on the right track. It's good to go, better to come back. Get on board, hold on tight, so far away from home. Strong, dark, thick black smoke, diesel fumes will make you choke. Stokers gone, no coal, no fire, no suit upon the line. Hear the click, clack, click, we're on the right track. It's good to go, better to come back. Get on board, hold on tight, far away from home. Always gone, no more steam, no crackling coal, no whistle scream. Just think back to a better time when steam was king. Hear the click, clack, click, we're on the right track. It's good to go, better to come back. Get on board, hold on tight, our journey's just begun. So far away from home, far away from home, our journey's at an end.